The noon sun beat down on the lonely platform of Willow Creek Station, turning the iron rails into silver ribbons that shimmered with heat. Dust swirled in the dry wind, carrying the faint scent of sage and coal smoke. Eleanor Ellie Hayes stood near a weathered bench, clutching her small leather suitcase and a letter that had grown soft from being unfolded too many times. Her heart thudded inside her corset, half from excitement, half from nerves. This was the day she was to meet Thomas Briggs, the man she'd been writing to for nearly 6 months, the man who had promised her a new beginning on the frontier. She'd left behind the gray streets of Kansas City, where her only prospects were the sewing factory and loneliness. Thomas's letters had spoken of golden fields, gentle horses, and a big farmhouse that needed a woman's touch. "You'll be my partner in all things," he'd written. "A home is just a house until a woman fills it with laughter." Those words had made Ellie's heart flutter. She'd believed them. But now, as the train pulled away in a cloud of steam, the platform was empty. No tall rancher in a Stetson hat stood waiting. No buggy, no bouquet, not even a note. The station master, an older man with a kind but tired face, gave her a sympathetic look as he checked his pocket watch. "You sure your fella knew which train, miss?" he asked. Ellie forced a small, shaky smile. "Yes, sir. He said he'd be right here when I arrived." "Well, maybe he's been delayed by chores. A lot of folks around here run on ranch time," he offered. But as the hours passed and shadows lengthened, even his optimism began to fade. Children came and went with their mothers. A salesman unloaded crates from the freight car. A young couple boarded the evening train, laughing, hand in hand. Ellie sat perfectly still on her trunk, her white travel dress growing wrinkled, her gloved hands trembling. She could feel the curious eyes of passers-by and hear their whispers. Poor thing. All dressed up and nobody to claim her. Inside, something fragile began to crack. She had come so far, traded her savings for this journey, pinned her future on a stranger's promises. And now she was alone in a town that didn't even know her name. As the sun sank behind the horizon, the last train whistle echoed into the distance. The station master approached again, his hat in his hands. "Miss, I hate to say it, but I've got to lock up soon. There's an inn down the road, simple place, but decent." Ellie nodded numbly. She tried to lift her suitcase, but her knees buckled under the weight, not of the bag, but of the disappointment. The station master kindly helped her to her feet. "You'll be all right," he said gently. "Sometimes folks lose their way, but the good Lord never does." She managed a faint, "Thank you," though her throat burned. As she stepped out into the cooling twilight, the wind tugged at her veil, carrying it off toward the tracks. She didn't chase it. Let it go, she thought bitterly, just like everything else. The road to town stretched ahead, empty and silent. Somewhere out there, her would-be groom had chosen not to come, and though she didn't know it yet, fate had other plans waiting in the dust and distance. Ellie Hayes walked into Willow Creek that night, not as a bride-to-be, but as a woman whose story had just begun. The Dalton Ranch stretched wide and golden beneath the morning sun, the fields rippling like an ocean of wheat. The sound of hooves and the creak of saddle leather echoed across the valley as Luke Dalton worked alongside his ranch hands, checking fences and herding stray cattle back toward the corral. To anyone looking on, he was the picture of strength and control. A man shaped by the land, hardened by work, and respected by everyone who knew him. But those who looked closer saw the quiet sorrow that lingered behind his steady eyes. 2 years had passed since his wife Clara died of fever, and yet her presence still haunted every corner of the house. Her rocking chair by the fireplace, the rose bushes she planted by the porch, the faded shawl still draped over the banister. Luke couldn't bring himself to move them. It was easier to leave things as they were than to face the emptiness that followed her loss. His 6-year-old son, Henry, was his only reason to keep going, But Henry had changed too. Once a cheerful, talkative boy, he had become withdrawn and quiet since his mother's death. He spent hours wandering near the stables or sitting beneath the big oak tree, whispering things to the wind as though talking to someone unseen. That morning, Luke found Henry sitting by the fence, his small hands holding a rough wooden horse he'd carved with his father's help. "What are you doing out here, son?" Luke asked, swinging down from his horse. Henry looked up, his brown eyes solemn. "Just waiting." "Waiting? For what?" The boy shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "For Mama." Luke's chest tightened. He crouched down beside him. "Henry, we've talked about this. Mama's with the angels now." Henry nodded, but his gaze didn't waver from the horizon. "I know, but I've been praying. I asked God to send her back. Maybe he did, and she's coming on the train." Luke was taken aback. "What train?" "The one from Kansas City," Henry said, his voice firm for once. "Can we go, Pa? Just to see?" Luke rubbed a hand over his jaw, torn between grief and tenderness. The boy's faith, so pure, so stubborn, reminded him too much of Clara. He didn't want to crush that hope, though it hurt to hear it. "The train?" he repeated quietly. Henry nodded again, clutching his little wooden horse. "Please, Pa, just today. I just feel like someone's waiting." Luke sighed, glancing at the distant line of hills. He had work to do, repairs, deliveries, and accounts, but none of it mattered when Henry looked up at him like that, eyes full of quiet pleading. "All right," he said finally. "We'll ride into town after lunch, but only for a bit." Henry's face lit up, the first real smile Luke had seen in weeks. He jumped up and hugged his father tightly. "Thank you, Pa." As the boy ran toward the house, Luke stood there a long moment, watching him go. Something about the request tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was just the need to see his son smile again, or maybe there was something more. That afternoon, as the wagon rattled down the dirt road toward Willow Creek, Luke glanced at Henry, who was sitting tall beside him, scanning the horizon with bright, hopeful eyes. "You think Mama's coming back today, huh?" Luke asked softly. Henry nodded, his voice full of quiet conviction. "Yes, sir. I just know she will." Luke chuckled faintly, shaking his head. But deep inside, a strange unease stirred. He didn't know it yet, but fate was leading them straight to the same train station where, at that very moment, a heartbroken bride sat alone on her trunk, waiting for someone who would never come. Their worlds were about to collide. His sons, Faith, her sorrow, and the miracle neither of them expected. The afternoon sun hung low over Willow Creek Station, turning the sky a hazy amber. Ellie Hayes sat alone on her trunk, her travel dress wrinkled and dusty, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. It had been more than a day since she arrived. Her money was nearly gone, and the boarding house matron had politely hinted she couldn't stay another night without payment. The shame of being the abandoned bride had spread through the small town like wildfire. People whispered when she walked past, some with pity, some with cruel amusement. Still, she sat there. A small, foolish hope kept her from leaving entirely, hope that Thomas Briggs might still come, explaining everything away with some charming excuse. Maybe he'd had an accident, or lost the letter with her arrival date. She told herself these things because the alternative, that she had been tricked, unwanted, forgotten, was too painful to bear. A faint rumble stirred the ground. A wagon was coming down the dusty road that led from the Dalton ranch. The driver was a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders broad beneath his worn shirt. Beside him sat a little boy, his hair the same shade of sun-browned gold as the fields. As the wagon drew closer, Ellie straightened, thinking perhaps it was Thomas after all. But then she saw the man's steady, rugged face, honest, unfamiliar, and the hopeful gleam in the boy's eyes. The wagon came to a halt near the platform, and before the man could even climb down, the little boy suddenly gasped. His small hand shot to his mouth, eyes wide as saucers. "Mama?" he whispered, then louder. "Mama? You came back!" Before Luke Dalton could stop him, Henry leapt from the wagon and ran full speed across the platform, his little boots kicking up dust. Ellie blinked in surprise as the boy flung himself into her skirts, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her dress. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ellie froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the boy, at the tears streaking his dusty cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, instinctively kneeling to comfort him. Her hand, trembling, brushed through his tousled hair. "I'm sorry, but I'm not your mama." Henry clung tighter, sobbing softly. "Yes, you are. I prayed, and you came." By the time Luke reached them, his face was flushed with embarrassment. "Henry," he said sharply. "Let the lady go." "That's not your mama, son." But Ellie, seeing the boy's heartbreak, shook her head gently. "It's all right. He's just confused." Luke tipped his hat, his voice low and apologetic. "Ma'am, I'm mighty sorry for this. My boy's been, well, he lost his mother a couple years back. Guess he still hopes she might come back someday." "It's all right," Ellie said softly, still kneeling beside the child. "He's got a kind heart." Luke's gaze lingered on her, on the sadness that clung to her like dust, on the weary dignity in her eyes. Something about her stirred a strange ache inside him. "You waiting for someone?" he asked gently. "I was," she said after a long pause. "But I think he's not coming." The honesty in her voice hit Luke harder than he expected. The silence stretched until Henry looked up, sniffling. "She looks like Mama Pa. Can't she come home with us?" Luke's breath caught, and Ellie blinked, startled by the innocent plea. She started to say something, but Luke spoke first. "Now, son, that's not how things work." Yet even as he said it, his heart twisted. This woman, alone, kind, lost, seemed to belong nowhere. He hesitated, then offered, "Ma'am, it's a long road to anywhere from here. You got somewhere to stay?" Ellie shook her head. "Not anymore." Luke nodded slowly. "Then, if you'd accept, you and your things can ride back with us for the night. Got a spare room at the ranch. Won't be fancy, but you'll be safe there." She hesitated, then met his eyes, steady and warm beneath his hat brim. Something about him felt trustworthy, solid, like the ground beneath her feet after a long fall. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd be grateful." As Luke helped her onto the wagon, Henry smiled so wide it nearly split his face. He nestled beside her on the seat as they rode toward the wide horizon, his little hand slipping into hers. Ellie didn't pull away, and though none of them said it, deep inside each heart flickered the same quiet feeling. Something had just changed forever. The Dalton Ranch came into view just as the sun began to slip behind the hills, painting the prairie in shades of rose and gold. Ellie had never seen land so wide, so open. It felt as though the earth itself breathed here. Fences stretched for miles, the faint sound of cattle carried on the breeze, and the big weathered farmhouse stood proudly against the horizon. Its white paint had faded, but there was a kind of strength in its bones, the same quiet strength she sensed in Luke Dalton himself. He helped her down from the wagon, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. "You can take the front room," he said, pointing toward the porch. "Ain't much, but it's clean and quiet." "My late wife," he stopped himself, clearing his throat. "Well, it's just me and Henry now," Ellie nodded, her heart softening. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. You and your boy have shown me great kindness." Luke tipped his hat slightly. "Luke'll do just fine." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and baking bread. A fire crackled in the hearth, and though the furnishings were simple, everything spoke of care. Ellie ran her fingers over a quilt folded neatly on the sofa. Then she saw the framed photograph above the mantel, a beautiful woman smiling beside Luke, a baby in her arms. Clara Dalton, the late wife. Suddenly, Ellie felt like an intruder in another woman's life. She shouldn't be here. But when Henry tugged on her hand and said, "Come see my room, Miss Ellie," she couldn't refuse. The boy's room was full of small, tender details. A rocking horse, a blanket with stars stitched into it, and a wooden box filled with little treasures, stones, feathers, and folded drawings. "This one's my mama," he said proudly, holding up a crayon sketch. The woman in the drawing wore a yellow dress and a big smile. Ellie knelt beside him, her voice soft. "You're very good at drawing, Henry. Your mama must have been a lovely lady." He nodded solemnly. She was. She used to sing while she made supper. The house was never quiet when Mama was here. Then he looked up at her, his eyes searching. "You could sing too, couldn't you?" Her throat tightened. "Maybe a little," she whispered. At supper, Luke joined them at the long wooden table. The meal was simple, roasted chicken, potatoes, and bread, but Ellie hadn't eaten so well in months. The warmth of the fire and the murmur of conversation filled the silence she had been carrying since the train station. Henry chattered about his pony and the baby calves, and Luke mostly listened, his deep voice occasionally rumbling with amusement. When Henry excused himself to fetch a toy, Luke spoke quietly. "I know this can't be easy for you. Being far from home with things not going as planned." Ellie managed a faint smile. "It's not what I expected. But kindness from strangers can feel like grace." He nodded, his gaze steady. "You're welcome here as long as you need to stay. Henry's taken to you something fierce." Her eyes flickered toward the window where the twilight deepened. "He reminds me of what I've lost," she admitted. "Hope, I suppose. It's been a long time since I believed in it." Luke's expression softened. "Hope's stubborn. Sometimes it shows up when we least deserve it." Before Ellie could answer, Henry came bounding back, clutching a small book. "Miss Ellie, will you read to me before bed?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." As she read aloud, Henry leaned against her arm, eyelids drooping. Luke stood in the doorway, watching quietly, the sight of his boy, peaceful again, filling him with an ache he hadn't felt in years. When Ellie closed the book and gently brushed a strand of hair from Henry's forehead, Luke knew something had shifted in the house. The air no longer felt as heavy. But later, when Ellie retired to the guest room, she found herself standing before Clara Dalton's portrait again. "You needn't worry," she whispered softly. "I'm only passing through." Still, as the wind sighed through the open window, she couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, this was exactly where she was meant to be. The days that followed slipped into a gentle rhythm, as if life at the Dalton Ranch had quietly made room for Ellie Hayes. Morning sunlight spilled through lace curtains, waking her to the sounds of roosters and the soft laughter of Henry chasing the barn cats. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she woke without dread pressing on her chest. At first, she tried to stay out of the way. She helped Mrs. Riggins, the housekeeper, with chores, careful not to overstep. She mended torn shirts, baked bread, and gathered eggs, grateful to have something to do with her hands. Work, she found, had a way of dulling pain. But before long, even the housekeeper started smiling at her. "You've got a soft touch with that boy," Mrs. Riggins remarked one afternoon as Ellie helped Henry knead biscuit dough. "I haven't seen him laugh that much in years." Ellie looked down at Henry's flour-covered cheeks and smiled faintly. "He reminds me that hearts can heal faster than we think." Henry adored her. Every day after breakfast, he begged her to read to him, or walk down to the creek to look for frogs, or sit under the old oak tree and tell stories. He started leaving wildflowers on her bedside table each morning, calling them for good luck. And when she sang, softly, shyly, while doing chores, he'd stop whatever he was doing just to listen. Luke noticed. He tried not to, but he did. From the porch, he'd find himself watching her hanging laundry in the sun, her hair catching the wind. Or he'd hear her laughter, light, unguarded, as Henry tugged her hand toward the corral to show her a new calf. It stirred something in him he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet ache, mixed with guilt. Clara had been gone for 2 years, but Luke had kept her memory alive so fiercely that he'd forgotten what it meant to live again. Yet here was this woman, kind, gentle, unassuming, breathing warmth into corners of the house that had long felt cold. Still, the townsfolk noticed too, and not all of them kindly. One morning, Ellie walked into the general store to buy sugar, only to find 2 women whispering near the counter. "That's her," one murmured. the bride who got stood up at the station. Now she's living at Luke Dalton's place. No ring on her finger. Ellie's cheeks burned. She paid quickly and left, the bag of sugar trembling in her hands. When Luke saw her face that afternoon, pale and tight-lipped, he asked gently, "Something wrong?" "Just people talking," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I moved on." His jaw tightened. "You've done nothing wrong, Ellie. Let 'em talk. They don't know what it means to lose something and find the courage to start again." Her gaze met his, and for a long moment, neither looked away. Something passed between them, something unspoken but unmistakable. That evening, the three of them sat by the hearth after supper. Henry had drawn a picture of the ranch, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "That's you, Pa," he said proudly, pointing. "And that's me, and that's Miss Ellie." Ellie blinked, her throat tightening. "That's beautiful, Henry," he smiled. "Maybe you could be my mama now?" The words fell like a stone in the silence that followed. Luke's breath caught, and Ellie's eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly. "Oh, Henry," she said softly, "your mama loved you very much." No one could ever take her place. Henry's little face fell. "I know. I just thought maybe you could stay." Luke knelt beside his son, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's not something we can just decide, son." But his voice wasn't stern, just tired, wistful. When Henry went off to bed, Ellie sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames. "I'm sorry if I've made things harder for you," she whispered. Luke shook his head slowly. "No, Ellie, you've made things easier, lighter." Outside, the prairie wind swept through the tall grass, whispering softly against the windows. Inside, the air was warm, filled with something fragile but real, the spark of belonging neither of them dared to name. The quiet peace that had settled over the Dalton ranch didn't last. It rarely does, not when the past comes knocking. It was a bright Saturday morning when the news spread. Thomas Briggs had returned to Willow Creek. Ellie heard it first from Mrs. Riggins, who came hurrying into the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ellie, dear, they say there's a man in town asking for you. Big fella, mean-looking. Says he's your betrothed." The spoon slipped from Ellie's hand and clattered into the mixing bowl. Her heart stuttered. He came back?" Mrs. Riggins nodded grimly. "Word is he's been drinking. You best let Mr. Dalton deal with him." Ellie's mind reeled. 1,000 thoughts crashed together, anger, confusion, and a flicker of foolish relief. For a moment, she had imagined he might have come to apologize, to make things right. But deep down, she knew better. By afternoon, the rumors had spread like wildfire. Thomas had been seen at the saloon, boasting loudly that his bride had run off with a widower and that he intended to set things straight. Luke heard it too. He was in the stables when one of the ranch hands told him. His jaw hardened, and he wiped his hands on a rag before striding toward the wagon. "Where's Henry?" he asked curtly. "Down by the creek with Miss Ellie," the ranch hand said. Luke's pulse quickened. "Tell her to stay put. I'll handle this." But by the time he reached town, Thomas was already at the general store, loud, red-faced, and half-drunk. "She's my fiancée," Thomas barked, slamming his fist on the counter. "She ran off with some rancher, and I aim to get her back, or get what I'm owed." Luke stepped through the doorway, calm but cold as steel. "That'll be enough," he said. Thomas turned, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to tell me what's enough?" "Luke Dalton," he said simply. "The man who's been keeping Miss Hayes safe." Thomas gave a mocking laugh. "Safe? Is that what you call it? Town says she's been staying under your roof." "I know what that means." Luke's fists clenched, but his voice stayed steady. "Watch your mouth." The tension drew a small crowd. Shopkeepers, farmers, and a few curious women gathered outside the door. Thomas sneered. "She's my bride, Dalton. Bought her train fare myself. She owes me for that." "She owes you nothing," Luke growled. Just then, Ellie appeared at the doorway. Henry had run home to fetch her, frightened by the shouting. She froze as Thomas's eyes landed on her. "Well, there you are," he said, voice dripping with false charm. "You had me worried sick, Ellie. Left me looking like a fool." You coming with me or not? Her throat went dry. You didn't come for me at the station, Thomas. You left me there, alone. Thomas shrugged. Wagon broke a wheel. Not my fault, but I came now, didn't I? He stepped closer, his breath sour with whiskey. Let's not make a scene. You and me, we'll head back, start fresh. Ellie took a step back. No, she said quietly but firmly. I won't go with you. His expression twisted into anger. You think that rancher's gonna make an honest woman out of you? Everyone in town's laughing, Ellie. You belong with me. Before he could reach for her, Luke moved between them, his voice low but dangerous. She said no. That means you turn around and ride out of here. Thomas glared at him. But the look in Luke's eyes, steady, unflinching, was enough. You'll regret this, Dalton, he spat, before stumbling out the door. The onlookers murmured, some nodding approvingly, others whispering behind their hands. Ellie stood trembling, tears burning her eyes. Luke turned to her gently. You all right? She nodded, though her voice trembled. Yes, thank you. As they walked back to the wagon, Luke saw the shame flicker across her face. Don't you dare blame yourself, he said quietly. That man's choices don't define who you are. But as they rode home, Ellie couldn't shake the heavy ache in her chest. The whispers would grow now, the gossip sharper than ever. She had thought she'd finally found peace, maybe even belonging. But the past had found her again. And the future she barely dared to dream of felt suddenly fragile. The storm rolled in just as dusk fell over the prairie, a thick, restless wind sweeping through the grass, bending trees until their branches groaned. The horizon turned a bruised purple, and thunder rumbled like the growl of something ancient and angry. At the Dalton Ranch, Ellie stood by the window, watching lightning flash against the far-off hills. The unease that had settled in her since Thomas Briggs's return refused to leave. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face twisted in anger, heard the cruel laughter of the townsfolk. She'd been trying to hold her head high, to help Luke with chores, to stay strong for Henry. But deep down, fear had crept back into her heart. Outside, Luke was hurrying to the barn, shouting orders to the ranch hands. The wind was picking up, and he could feel the change in the air, a dry, electric stillness that warned of danger. When the first fat drops of rain began to fall, he turned back toward the house. Inside, Henry was gathering his toy horses, chattering to Ellie about the thunder. Don't be scared, he said, his voice small but brave. Pa says storms come and go. They just make things grow better after. Ellie smiled faintly, brushing his hair back. Your pa's a wise man. Just then, Luke burst through the door, rain streaking his face. We need to get the animals secured, he said breathlessly. The lightning's hitting close. I'll handle the barn. Ellie, keep Henry inside. But before she could answer, a blinding flash split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder so fierce it shook the floorboards. Then came the unmistakable smell, smoke. Luke froze. His heart dropped. He threw the door open again. Across the yard, the barn roof was ablaze, orange flames licking up toward the heavens. No! He shouted, sprinting into the storm. Ellie's breath caught. Without thinking, she grabbed a blanket and ran after him. The wind howled, driving rain sideways, but it did nothing to quench the fire. The barn glowed like a monstrous lantern against the dark sky. Luke and the men worked frantically, forming a line with buckets of water, shouting over the roar of the wind. Horses screamed from inside. Get them out! Luke yelled. He plunged through the smoke, disappearing into the burning doorway. Ellie's heart raced. She could hear Henry crying behind her on the porch, terrified. She hesitated, then ran forward, pulling the blanket over her head. Luke! She shouted, her voice breaking. Inside, the air was thick and choking. She could barely see. Flames crawled up the wooden beams like living things. Somewhere to her right, she heard a desperate whinny. She rushed toward it, untying the frightened mare and slapping its flank to drive it out the door. Then another sound froze her in place, Henry's voice, faint and terrified. Miss Ellie! Her heart nearly stopped. He was supposed to be inside. She spun toward the open door and saw him, small and shaking, standing just inside the threshold, calling for her. A beam crashed down nearby, sparks flying. Henry! she screamed. "Get back!" But the boy was frozen in fear. Without a second thought, Ellie dashed forward, scooping him into her arms just as another beam fell behind them. She shielded his head with her body, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. Suddenly, strong arms grabbed them both. Luke, soot-covered, wild-eyed, hauled them out into the rain. The three of them stumbled into the mud as the barn roof collapsed with a deafening roar behind them. Ellie gasped for air, clutching Henry close. Luke dropped beside them, pulling them both into his arms as rain poured over them, steam hissing where it hit the flames. For a long moment, they just sat there, muddy, shaking, alive. Henry whimpered softly. I was scared, Pa." Luke pressed his son's head to his chest, voice hoarse. "You're safe now, boy. You're safe." Then his eyes lifted to Ellie, her face streaked with soot, her hair clinging wetly to her cheeks. You went in after him." "I couldn't let him burn," she whispered, her voice raw. "I couldn't lose him, Luke." He swallowed hard. The words that rose in his chest. "Thank you. I need you. I can't lose you either," got tangled somewhere between his heart and his throat. Instead, he simply brushed her face with a trembling hand, eyes full of something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with love. The barn smoldered behind them, a ruin of ash and memory. But in the middle of the wreckage, as thunder rolled across the sky, something new was born, a bond forged in fire, fierce and unbreakable. The fire left a scar on the Dalton Ranch, both on the land and in the hearts of those who called it home. The morning after, the smell of smoke still hung in the air, and a fine layer of ash coated everything in sight. The barn was nothing but charred beams and blackened earth. Yet, against all odds, no one had been lost. Luke stood at the edge of the ruins, his hat in his hands, his face unreadable. The horses were safe. The men were exhausted, and the ranch was quiet except for the sound of the wind whispering through the broken timbers. Ellie watched him from the porch, her heart heavy. She had tended to Henry, soothed his nightmares, and cleaned his scrapes. But she hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames again, saw Luke disappearing into the inferno, her own desperate run after him, the terrifying moment she thought she'd lose them both. She wrapped her shawl tighter and walked down to him. The grass was wet, the air cool. He didn't turn when she stopped beside him. "They're saying it started with lightning," he said quietly, his voice rough from smoke. "Hit the east beam first. If it had been 5 minutes later, we'd have lost the stock too." Ellie nodded. "You saved them, Luke, all of them." He gave a small, bitter smile. "And nearly lost you and Henry." He turned then, his blue eyes dark and full of things he couldn't quite say. "You shouldn't have gone in there, Ellie." She lowered her gaze. "How could I not?" Henry was inside. "I couldn't just stand there." "I know," he said softly. "That's what scares me." For a long moment they stood in silence. The wind tugged at her shawl, and a few flakes of ash drifted up from the ground, carried away into the gray morning. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "I thought I'd lost you too, when you ran in." She broke off, swallowing hard. "Luke, I can't remember ever being that afraid." He reached out, his hand brushing her arm. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." Ellie looked up at him then. Really looked at the man who had taken her in when no one else would, who had defended her name in town, who had fought fire itself to keep his family safe. Something inside her cracked open, something she had kept buried beneath layers of shame and fear and loneliness. "Luke," she whispered, "you and Henry, you've given me more kindness than I ever deserved. I came here a stranger, a woman everyone pitied or laughed at. And yet you—" He took a slow breath, his voice low. "You belong here, Ellie. You've belonged from the start." Her heart fluttered painfully. "Don't say that unless you mean it." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the chill air. "I've meant it every day since the first morning you poured me coffee and smiled like you didn't believe you had the right to." "You do, Ellie. You do." Tears welled in her eyes. "But the town, Thomas, they'll say I trapped you, that I—" I don't give a damn what the town says, Luke interrupted, his voice suddenly fierce. You saved my boy. You saved me. That's all that matters. Ellie's lips trembled. Luke, I don't know how to be what you need. He shook his head slowly. You already are. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sky above them began to lighten, streaks of dawn piercing through the smoky haze. Then Luke reached out, his rough fingers brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I don't want to hide what I feel anymore, he said softly. Not from you, not from anyone. Her breath caught. Luke! He smiled faintly, a rare, gentle thing. Ellie Hayes, I think I started loving you the day you walked into my life, and I haven't stopped since. The words hung between them, fragile and sacred. For the first time in years, Ellie didn't flinch from tenderness. She simply stood there, tears on her lashes, the morning sun glinting on the wet grass, and let herself believe. For once, she wasn't the woman left behind. She was the woman someone had chosen and meant it. For a brief time, peace returned to the Dalton Ranch. After the fire, the days were quieter, filled with rebuilding and gratitude. Luke and Ellie worked side by side, the air between them charged with something unspoken but no longer hidden. There were glances that lingered, touches that said more than words. Even the ranch hands noticed the change, the way Luke's voice softened when he spoke to her, the way Ellie's laughter, once hesitant, now came easier. But peace has a way of being tested. Especially in a small town that never forgets a rumor. It started with whispers again, this time sharper, uglier. The blacksmith's wife saw Luke and Ellie at the market standing too close. A farmhand's cousin said she'd heard Ellie was living as Mrs. Dalton without a wedding. By the time Sunday rolled around, the gossip had turned poisonous. When Ellie entered the church with Henry's small hand in hers, conversations hushed. Heads turned. Mrs. Riggins, faithful as ever, tried to shield her with small talk, but the judgment in the air was heavy. Reverend Cole's sermon that morning spoke of virtue and appearances, and though he never said her name, Ellie felt each word like a stone. Afterward, outside the church, Thomas Briggs appeared again. He looked different this time, sober but colder. His pride had been wounded in front of the entire town weeks before, and the humiliation still burned. He'd heard the gossip, too, and now he meant to twist it into something crueler. Quite the picture, he said, voice smooth as oil, eyes glinting. A woman abandoned by her betrothed finds comfort with the nearest widower. How convenient. Luke, who had just stepped down from the wagon, froze. You got something to say, Briggs? Thomas sneered. Only that a man ought to keep his house respectable. Or does she have you so bewitched you don't care what people think? Ellie's face went pale, but she stood her ground. You've done enough damage, Thomas. Leave us be. He gave a mock bow. You're not a bride, Miss Hayes. You're a scandal. A charity case. And when Luke Dalton's done playing hero, you'll be right back where you started, alone. That was enough. Luke stepped forward, his jaw set, voice low but shaking with anger. You'd best walk away before I forget I'm standing in front of the Lord's house. Thomas's eyes darted to the growing crowd, the townsfolk who had spilled out after the sermon, eager for a show. He smirked. Go on, Dalton, hit me. Prove to everyone she's the kind of woman who ruins men. For a heartbeat, it seemed Luke might. His hands curled into fists. But then he caught Ellie's eyes, wide, trembling, full of shame that wasn't hers to bear, and he stopped. Instead, he said quietly, You don't get to decide her worth, Briggs. Not anymore. Then he turned to the onlookers, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. You all know me. You know what kind of man I am. I won't let anyone call her less than she is. Ellie Hayes is under my roof because she's family, because she's brave, because she saved my boy's life. And if that offends you, that's your burden to carry, not hers. The words hung heavy in the air. A few people looked away. Others nodded slightly. Even Reverend Cole's stern expression softened. Thomas's smirk faltered. He muttered something under his breath and stalked off toward the saloon, shoulders stiff with defeat. Ellie stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Luke turned to her, his eyes gentle now. It's over, he murmured, but she shook her head. No, Luke, it's not over. Not until I stop letting them shame me for surviving. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, I'm done hiding, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Done being afraid to take up space to be seen beside you. You said I belong here. Maybe it's time I start believing that myself. For a long moment, Luke just looked at her. Pride, admiration, and love all mixing in his eyes. Then let's give them something worth talking about, he said softly. And there, in the golden afternoon light, before the whispering town, he reached for her hand. Ellie didn't pull away this time. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but she didn't hear it. For the first time, she held her head high, her fingers warm in his, knowing that whatever came next, she wasn't walking through it alone. Spring came early that year to Willow Creek. The hills that had been blackened by fire only months ago now bloomed with green again, wildflowers pushing bravely through the soil. Life, it seemed, had decided to begin anew, and so had Ellie Hayes. It had been several weeks since that Sunday confrontation outside the church. The whispers had faded, replaced by quieter talk. Admiration from some, reluctant respect from others. Luke Dalton had stood by her, steady as the earth itself, and slowly the town had followed his example. Folks who once turned their heads now greeted her kindly in passing. Mrs. Riggins even said she'd overheard the pastor's wife admit that perhaps Miss Hayes was more decent than most, gave her credit for. But Ellie didn't seek their approval anymore. Something had changed in her heart since that day, since Luke's hand found hers in the open daylight. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. The ranch was busy with rebuilding. The new barn stood proud and strong, painted bright red, with Henry's small handprint pressed into one of the beams, a mark of hope, as Luke called it. Ellie had insisted on helping, and Luke had laughed when she picked up a hammer, but he hadn't stopped her. She had earned her place there, side by side with him. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Luke found her on the porch mending one of Henry's shirts. He leaned against the railing, quiet for a while, watching her hands move with patient care. The light painted her hair gold, and something warm filled his chest. You work too much, he said finally. She smiled without looking up. Says the man who's been fixing fences since dawn, he chuckled. Fair enough. Then his voice softened. You've done more for this place than you'll ever know, Ellie. Her needle paused mid-stitch. I've just done what anyone would do. Not everyone would, he said. You turned this house back into a home. She looked up at him then, her eyes glimmering with the last of the sunset. You and Henry did that for me first. He took a step closer. Ellie, I meant what I said back in town. I don't care what anyone thinks, but I care what you want. If you'd rather go somewhere new, start fresh without all the shadows here, I'd understand. She stared at him, surprised. Leave? He nodded slowly. If that's what you need to be happy. Her hand trembled as she set the needle aside. Luke Dalton, she whispered, for the first time in my life I am happy. Right here. He exhaled softly, a smile breaking across his face, the kind that reached his eyes. Then there's something I've been meaning to ask. He dropped to one knee, the wood creaking under his weight. Ellie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Ellie Hayes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've been my partner in every way that matters. You've cared for my boy like your own. You've faced fire, gossip, and grief and never once turned away. I don't want another day to pass without calling you my wife. Will you marry me? For a heartbeat, the world went still, the wind, the birds, even her breath. Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Then stronger, through her tears, yes, Luke, 1,000 times yes. He rose, pulling her into his arms as Henry burst out the door, whooping with joy. Mama said yes, he shouted, and Ellie laughed through her tears, hugging him tight. That night, as lantern light flickered through the window and the sounds of crickets filled the warm air, Ellie sat on the porch once more, no longer the frightened woman left behind at the station, but a bride with a home, a family, and a future. She looked out over the land that had nearly destroyed her and now had healed her. The stars stretched wide above the ranch, and somewhere deep in her chest, peace bloomed like the spring itself. She had come to Willow Creek with nothing but a suitcase and a broken promise. Now she had everything that truly mattered, a son's laughter, a man's love, and a place where she finally belonged.